The Hundred Years' War killed millions and lasted longer than most people's lifetimes. The Mongol invasions depopulated entire regions by 30 to 90%. The Wars of the Roses eliminated so many noble families that England's aristocracy had to be rebuilt from scratch. Medieval wars didn't just kill soldiers, they destroyed demographic structures, collapsed economies, and created generational trauma that affected societies for centuries after fighting stopped. Hollywood shows you battles and then happy endings. Real medieval wars were multi-generational catastrophes that killed civilians more than combatants, destroyed economic infrastructure, created famine and plague conditions, and left psychological damage in survivors that echoed through their children and grandchildren. Once you understand how wars actually destroyed generations, every movie battle becomes comfortable fiction that ignores decades of suffering. Stand in England during the Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 1487, and watch an entire generation of nobility disappear. Historical records show that roughly 50 to 80 noble families that existed in 1450 were extinct by 1500, eliminated through combat deaths, executions, and failure to produce male heirs. You'd see the ruling class literally destroyed and replaced within one generation. The Hundred Years' War, 1337 to 1453, depopulated France catastrophically. Regional studies show population declines of 30 to 50% in war zones like Normandy, Aquitaine, and Ile-de-France. You'd watch villages that had 200 people in 1340 containing 80 people in 1450. The missing weren't just dead soldiers, they were civilians killed, starved, or displaced by over a century of intermittent warfare. The Mongol invasions present even starker numbers. Historical estimates suggest the Khwarezmian Empire lost 90% of its population. You'd see cities of 100,000 reduced to 10,000. The demographic destruction was so complete that some regions didn't recover their pre-invasion populations for 200 plus years. Multiple generations were effectively erased. The Albigensian Crusade, 1209 to 1229, against Cathar heretics in southern France killed an estimated 200,000 to 1 million people in 20 years. You'd watch an entire regional culture, language, religious practices, political structures eliminated within one generation through systematic warfare and religious persecution. Child mortality spiked during wars. You'd see infants and children dying at rates 50 to 100% higher than peacetime. Due to malnutrition, disease, and direct violence, wars didn't just kill the current generation, they prevented the next generation from being born or surviving to reproduce. The cascade effect was mathematical certainty. You'd watch villages losing 40% of population in war, then the survivors struggled to maintain agriculture, leading to food shortages that killed another 20%. The demographic spiral could take decades to reverse, if it reversed at all. Medieval wars eliminated not just individuals, but entire population cohorts, creating demographic voids that affected societies for centuries. Stand in France during the Hundred Years' War and watch economic infrastructure systematically destroyed. The English chevauché strategy, deliberate destruction of economic assets, wasn't random pillaging. You'd see organized campaigns burning mills, slaughtering livestock, destroying vineyards and orchards that took decades to establish. A burned mill meant villages couldn't process grain. You'd watch communities that lost mills reverting to hand grinding, labor-intensive work that reduced productivity dramatically. Rebuilding required capital investment that war-devastated regions couldn't afford. Some communities didn't rebuild mills for generations. Vineyard and orchard destruction had multi-decade impacts. You'd see armies cutting down fruit trees and vines that had taken 10 to 20 years to reach productivity. The destroyed agricultural investments couldn't be quickly replaced. Regions that had produced wine or fruit commercially were reduced to subsistence farming for 30 to 40 years until new plantings matured. The tax base collapse forced states into debt cycles that lasted generations. You'd watch English crown debt from the Hundred Years' War compound across decades. By the war's end, England owed creditors amounts it couldn't repay in single generation. The debt burden passed to children and grandchildren who inherited financial obligations from wars they hadn't fought. Trade route disruption had cascading effects. You'd see merchant families that had operated for generations going bankrupt when wars made trade routes impassable. The Hanseatic League cities lost markets during various conflicts, creating economic depressions that lasted decades. Commercial networks destroyed in years took generations to rebuild. Skilled labor populations were killed or displaced. You'd watch craftsmen, blacksmiths, weavers, masons dying in wars or fleeing war zones. The loss of skilled workers meant economic capacity decreased. Training replacements took years, creating generation-long gaps in productive capacity. Wars destroyed economic infrastructure faster than societies could rebuild it, creating poverty that persisted for generations after fighting ended. Stand in war zones and count the orphans. Medieval wars created orphan populations that overwhelmed social support systems designed for peacetime levels. You'd see children raised by extended family, monasteries, or not raised at all, simply dying from neglect. The Wars of the Roses created thousands of noble orphans specifically. You'd watch children whose fathers died in battles like Towton, 1461, approximately 28,000 casualties, growing up as wards of the crown or other nobles. These weren't benevolent adoptions. Wardship was property right where guardians controlled estates and could exploit them until children came of age. Peasant orphans had it worse. You'd see children whose parents died from war-related famine or disease with no institutional support. Some were absorbed by relatives, but families struggling to survive often couldn't take additional mouths. Many orphans became beggars, laborers, or died young from malnutrition and exposure. The psychological impact wasn't understood, but was real. You'd watch war orphans developing what modern psychology would recognize as attachment disorders, PTSD, and developmental trauma. They grew into adults whose childhood trauma affected their parenting, perpetuating cycles of dysfunction into the next generation. Monasteries and convents absorbed some orphans. You'd see religious institutions functioning as orphanages by default during major wars. But the institutions were also affected by warfare. Monasteries lost funding, were sacked during conflicts, struggled to feed the children they sheltered. The demographic impact compounded. You'd watch orphan populations having higher mortality, lower marriage rates, and fewer children when they did marry. Wars that created mass orphans-affected population growth 2 generations later when those orphans reached reproductive age but were too damaged or poor to raise large families. War orphans numbered in thousands during major conflicts, and societies lacked infrastructure to raise them properly, creating damaged generations. Stand in 1315 to 1322 during the Great Famine that killed 10 to 25% of Europe's population. You'd watch crop failures compounded by military campaigns that destroyed stored food, slaughtered draft animals, and prevented planting. Wars didn't just coincide with famines, they created and amplified them. The siege warfare strategy deliberately starved populations. You'd see armies surrounding cities for months or years, blocking food supplies to force surrender. Rouen during the 100 Years' War, 1418 to 1419, was besieged for 6 months. The city expelled non-combatants to conserve food, and those expelled starved in the no-man's land between city walls and besieging army. Thousands died before the city surrendered. Armies consumed or destroyed food supplies systematically. You'd watch medieval armies of 10,000 to 30,000 men marching through regions and eating everything available. A large army could strip an area of food in days. They took grain, livestock, preserved foods, leaving nothing for civilians who faced winter without supplies. The farming cycle disruption had multi-year impacts. You'd see peasants unable to plant because armies camped in fields, because their draft animals were stolen, because they fled violence during planting season. One missed planting meant food shortages for a year. Multiple years of disrupted farming meant famine. Recovery required years of successful harvests that war zones rarely got. Disease followed armies like shadows. You'd watch typhus, dysentery, and plague spreading wherever armies marched. Soldiers carried diseases to new regions. Armies created sanitation disasters, thousands of men producing waste, corpses rotting after the battles. These conditions bred disease that killed civilians more than soldiers. The Black Death, 1347 to 1353, killed 30 to 60% of Europe's population, but wars made it worse. You'd see plague hitting war-devastated regions harder because populations were already malnourished and weakened. Areas that might have lost 30% to plague alone lost 50% when plague hit populations already damaged by war and famine. famine and disease worked synergistically with warfare, creating death tolls that dwarfed combat casualties and persisted for years after battles ended. Stand in war zones during the 100 Years' War and watch social structures collapse. You'd see villages where the lord died, the priest fled, and the remaining peasants abandoned fields because there weren't enough workers left to farm communally. The social contracts that made medieval society function simply broke down. Law enforcement disappeared during wars. You'd watch regions where royal authority collapsed and bandit companies, often former soldiers, controlled territories. The routiers and écorcheurs in France were organized military units that became criminal enterprises when not employed in warfare. They terrorized regions for decades, making roads impassable and economic recovery impossible. Marriage patterns disrupted catastrophically. You'd see severe gender imbalances in post-war populations, often more women than men after battles killed military-age males. This created marriage markets where women couldn't find husbands, reducing birth rates for generations. Regions needed 20 to 40 years for population-sex ratios to normalize. Religious institutions struggled or failed. You'd watch monasteries that had functioned for centuries closing because war killed monks, destroyed endowments, or made regions too dangerous for recruitment. The spiritual and educational services these institutions provided vanished, leaving gaps that affected multiple generations. Trust between communities broke permanently. You'd see villages that had traded and intermarried for centuries becoming enemies because one supported different sides in conflicts. The Wars of the Roses created regional enmities in England that persisted generations after the fighting stopped. Communities remembered which neighbours had betrayed them, stolen from them, or killed their relatives. The accumulation of trauma changed societies fundamentally. You'd watch populations that had experienced decades of intermittent warfare, developing cultures of suspicion, violence, and desperation. Children raised in war zones grew into adults who knew only violence, and they raised the next generation with the same trauma-based worldview. Social breakdown during wars created dysfunctional societies that took generations to rebuild, if they rebuilt at all. Stand in 1500 and meet someone whose grandfather fought in the Wars of the Roses. You'd hear stories of battles, executions, and dispossession passed down through family memory. That person's life was shaped by events before they were born. Inherited debt, lost estates, family feuds, trauma-based parenting. The psychological damage was invisible but real. Modern research on generational trauma shows that children of traumatized parents develop differently. More anxiety, more hypervigilance, altered stress responses. Medieval people didn't understand the mechanism, but you'd see the effects. Populations that had endured wars produced children who were more violent, more distrustful, more damaged than peacetime populations. Economic recovery required multiple generations. You'd watch regions that lost 40% of their population in the 100 Years' War still struggling economically in 1500, 50 years after fighting ended. The destroyed infrastructure, depleted population, accumulated debt, and lost commercial networks couldn't be fixed in one generation. The demographic voids persisted. You'd see regions that never recovered their pre-war populations because the survivors had fewer children, and those children had fewer children. The mathematical cascade of reduced fertility continued for generations after the initial population loss. The cultural memory embedded itself permanently. You'd watch families passing down hatred, teaching children to distrust certain regions or families based on conflicts their great-grandparents experienced. Political instability became self-perpetuating. Regions destabilized by one war became vulnerable to the next because they never fully recovered between conflicts. The knowledge systems collapsed and stayed collapsed. You'd see regions that had universities, libraries, and educated populations before wars, reduced to near illiteracy after books were burned, scholars fled or died, educational institutions closed. The intellectual recovery took generations longer than physical reconstruction. Some knowledge was lost permanently, texts that existed in single copies, destroyed in sieges or fires, gone forever. The institutional memory vanished with the deaths. You'd watch craft guilds that had maintained techniques for centuries losing their masters in wars. The apprentices who survived didn't have the full training. Skills degraded across generations. Metalworking, architecture, textile production, all diminished in quality because the knowledge transfer was interrupted by mass death. Medieval wars didn't end when the fighting stopped. They created wounds in societies that took centuries to heal, if they healed at all. Every medieval conflict was a multi-generational catastrophe whose effects rippled through time, affecting people who were born long after the last battle was fought. That's what Hollywood doesn't show you. The real cost of medieval wars wasn't paid on battlefields. It was paid in the decades and generations of suffering that followed.